Good morning and welcome to the first episode of the IAPC Book Talks. This is a new webcast that's produced by the Institute for the Advancement of Philosophy for Children at Montclair State University, the world's oldest organization devoted to young people's philosophical practice. In this webcast series, we interview authors of books that explore philosophy for children, philosophy of childhood, philosophy in children's literature, and the educational role of philosophy. I'm delighted this morning to be joined by Kenneth B. Kidd, a professor of English at the University of Florida. Professor Kidd's primary field of research is Anglophone children's literature studies, and he's especially interested in how that field interacts with other fields like philosophy, psychology, critical theory. He's the author of Making American Boys, subtitled Boyology and the Feral State, 2004, and Freud in Oz, at the Intersection of Psychoanalysis and Children's Literature, 2011. He's also the co-editor with Darrett Mason of Queer as Camp, Essays on Summer, Style, and Sexuality in 2019, and of another anthology that I'm currently enjoying, Wild Things, Children's Culture and Eco-Criticism. It's co-edited by Sydney Dorbin. Today, Kenneth joins us to talk about his latest book, Theory for Beginners, Children's Literature as Critical Thought. That's published by Fordham University Press, and I'll just mention that Fordham is offering a 25% discount on its website this month. So thanks for joining me this morning, Kenneth, for this book talk.
Thank you for having me. I'm very much looking forward to it. It's exciting to be here, and thank you for that generous introduction.
So I'm excited too.
Yeah.
And welcome to all those of you watching this webcast live. We have people from quite a few countries joining us this morning. If you have questions for Professor Kidd, you may type them into the Q&A box on your Zoom screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. I've invited Kenneth to start us off this morning by giving us an overview presentation about his book. So Kenneth, please tell us about Theory for Beginners.
Okay, I will do that. Is everyone ready for a bad PowerPoint presentation? Because that will be part of our experience today. I am going to share my screen, and I do have a few images. So I have a few images and a little bit of a script. So I'll speak for maybe 15-ish minutes, and then we can go to questions and discussion, if that's good.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thanks.
Awesome. All right. So let's see. I'm going to play from the start. I'm assuming everybody can see this okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So so thanks again for being here, everyone. Really appreciate it. And I feel a little bit like I'm preaching to the choir with this audience in terms of thinking about the philosophical power of children's literature. I know that's the core principle of the IAPC and of the movement in general. So it's nice to be in conversation with people that are experts and know a lot more about this than I do, frankly. And I just apologize if some of these, arguments and concepts seem too familiar, because, for me, it was sort of a discovery of an exciting enterprise. And so, there may be places where you may be thinking, I know this already. So sorry for that. So my third book is Theory for Beginners, and it does look at the relationship of children's literature and young adult literature, very expansively construed at the relationship of that to philosophy for children and to something I'm calling Theory for Beginners, which is the title of the book, as you can see. And children's literature, I think we would agree, is a lot of things. It's a mode of address, it's a literary tradition or heritage, it's a multi-genre body of work, it's a publishing category or a publishing enterprise, and also a professional field of study for folks working in a number of different areas. And those aspects may or may not align with each other always, right? But I think most fundamentally, that it's a set of textual experiments in feeling, thinking, and interacting. As we know, children's literature is often imaginative, expansive, and surprising in its strategies of engagement and cultivation. It invites all of us to dream, to wonder, to explore. And helping children to read, it also helps children to read in the sense of interpret, right? Contextualize, understand, because we know from RuPaul that reading is fundamental. And I think it does this work often self-reflexively, inviting readers to sort of engage materially, textually with the text and with the images, as much as engaging, emotionally or psychologically, although there's certainly that as well. literature for younger children, as we know, often takes picture book form or image text form. And we also have seen a lot of graphic narratives or illustrated image text narratives for older readers, especially in the last 5, 10 years, but I mean, arguably a little longer than that. And these materials are not just illustrated, right? Um, they invite and they demand, I think, sometimes different kinds of interaction that recognize the image text form specifically. So given all of this, it's maybe not surprising that philosophical and psychological sort of work looks to children's literature for inspiration, and I think vice versa, and that children's literature has both a psychological and a philosophical sort of texture. So, and the reason I mentioned psychology is that is the work of the previous book, which Maughn mentioned, Freud and Oz. And I do think of Freud and Oz and Theory for Beginners as kind of a pair of sorts. The first book, Freud and Oz, really does look at the mutualities or reciprocities of children's literature and psychology. And I was interested there, not simply in interpreting children's literature psychologically, but showing how children's literature increasingly has what we think of as a psychological texture and was understood that way across the 20th century into the current moment. And then on the other side of things, the extent to which psychological programs, both theory and clinical practice, including therapy, draws on sort of narratives for children. And this goes way back. I mean, Freud actually had other analysts work in fairy tales because it was a common language for everyone. So there's chapters in that book that deal with a wide range of this: history, picture book psychology. There's a chapter on sort of on literature and of trauma or atrocity. There's a chapter on Winnie the Pooh, because conversations around A.A. Milne's Winnie the Pooh stories very much have been about both philosophy and psychology from almost from the beginning, with the publication of popular handbooks around Pooh and the Tao of Pooh, the Day of Piglet, for example, and there's some other examples. So in any case, that's just a little bit of backstory for this book. So Theory for Beginners kind of builds on that work, but sort of tries to shift focus to philosophy and thinking about how philosophy and theory draw motivation and texture also from children's literature, both more conventionally and more expansively understood. And then at the same time, I'm interested in how philosophy and theory develop what I'm calling a literature for beginners. And this is maybe a little more of an emphasis with the theory part than with the philosophy part. But there's definitely an aspect of kind of sort of beginner-friendly themes in philosophy as well, right? Like psychoanalysis, philosophy and theory are ostensibly adult projects that nonetheless concern themselves with childhood and make use of and sometimes produce texts for children and or beginners. So in any case, that's kind of the relationship that the two projects have. Theory for Beginners, like Freud and Oz, takes a pretty flexible, maybe sometimes a too fuzzy understanding of what counts as children's literature. And that's also a theme in a more recent project, which I just wanted to briefly self-promote, which is our newest collection, Alt Kid Lit. And this is an edited collection that I did with Derek Mason, who also worked with me on the Queer as Camp project. And Alt Kid Lit, it really kind of tries to think about children's literature in alternative registers, methodologies that haven't been used, materials that are not considered children's literature typically, just new frames for the pictures, and maybe new pictures sometimes too. It's a collection of essays, fantastic essays, international in scope and wide range in form, includes a lot of early career scholars. I think it's a good book. It's going to be out sometime in the spring. We just got page proofs this week, so that's how I'll be spending the holidays. But anyway, I'm really excited about that book coming out too. All right. So the idea that children's books might contain sort of adult content or be concerned with theoretical or philosophical knowledge is a kind of uneasy truth that's long been acknowledged. As we can see in the examples of kind of mock picture books or joke picture books for adults, which both acknowledge this possibility of adult content in children's books and also make fun of that idea. The classic example of this is this book that's now on screen. I've talked about it probably too many times in my work, but it's called A Child's Guide to Freud. It was produced or published in 1963, and it's a very deliberate send-up of both Freudian ideas and the idea that children should be exposed to them. And this was a sort of New Yorker affiliated project, with the illustrator being a New Yorker cartoonist. What's telling is that this book was published the very same year as Marie Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, which I don't have an image of in front of you, but that's a kind of classic picture book in the American tradition. And that book, Where the Wild Things Are, is not about Freud exactly, but it's very much about kind of complicated feelings, anger, ambivalence, the desire for mastery, maybe even a little revenge, and so on. And Sendak's book, Where the Wild Things Are, is kind of credited with giving expression to dramas of the unconscious, and therefore sort of doing psychological, or at least emotional labor, right, for kids or with kids, and building on commentary about fairy tales in that tradition. So this, this reality or fact that children's books do important and serious work, including psychological and philosophical work, is now taken seriously rather than mocked. But we do have a tradition of sort of amused engagement around it. And so these are just a few more pages from this book, which is very funny. And it's not quite as mean-spirited in some ways as some of the more contemporary mock picture books, like Go the Fuck to Sleep, etc. But in any case, philosophy, as we know, is sometimes framed as something to be taken up only later in life with maturity. But philosophy is also, as you know better than I do, imagined as especially appropriate for children and or novices or beginners. And this is most evident in the Philosophy for Children movement, which I was super interested to learn about. And that's what's brought me into conversation with you today. And as I show in the first chapter of Theory for Beginners, Philosophy for Children, which I will refer to as P4C, I'm assuming that's pretty standard. P4C builds on the philosophical foundations of children's literature, which has been invested in philosophical and educational commitments from the beginning, I think. It builds on those traditions while also revising it by imagining it more explicitly, imagining children's literature more explicitly as philosophy in sort of creative form. And that's a very important insight. And it's one that I think literary scholars have been slower to come to. I can talk about that a little bit later if you like. P4C does not represent, of course, all philosophy, but it's an important initiative, one partaking of both analytic and continental traditions. And in the meantime, what's called theory, and that's a whole nother conversation, is what is theory? But what's called theory, despite its reputation for complexity and difficulty, it has also mined classic children's books for wisdom, and even self-positioned as for beginners, especially given priority to new methods and perspectives over mastery and over established knowledge. So beginners, of course, are not always children, and any more than children are always beginners. But there is overlap between the two categories, and that's the territory I kind of wanted to explore in the book, even if I don't always get it right. So I suggest in the second chapter that Theory for Beginners sort of resembles children's literature in its methods of education and or in its enthusiasm for learning. In presenting for and identifying with the beginner, theory participates in a kind of children's literature, even when it doesn't also, as it sometimes does, invoke specific children's titles. A lot of the classic fantasies show up in psychoanalytic theory, even in deconstructive theory. Derrida talks at length about Alice in Wonderland, for example. Scholars are not the only people invested in these associations or reciprocities. In the popular press, of course, we see faith in Dr. Seuss, for example, and more generally faith in the philosophical power of both childhood and children's literature. Popular philosophy especially now finds its reflection in children's literature, and that's in and around the success, I think, of P4C. I think P4C has really signal boosted and amplified in a significant way that association, as well as done, super important educational and practical work on the ground. Across the world, children's books, chapter books, and young adult novels are all sort of embedded and used in P4C. Any number of children's and young adult texts might be, sort of used for their philosophical or theoretical insights. And that's partly because they were sometimes inspired by philosophical questions, right? Granted, most of the children's books that interest P4C advocates are not explicitly about philosophers or philosophical categories. And there are a few exceptions. I imagine this is the most famous. I know this is maybe the image may be a little fuzzy, but we're looking at Justin Gardner's young adult novel Sophie's World, which is perhaps overly canonical in the literature. It's a famous exception to this rule that generally the children's books that are worked with are not about philosophy. This one is. It's both a philosophical novel and a novel about philosophy. In fact, it's almost a history of a philosophy. Another example, more contemporary and aimed at younger kids, is the European Plato and Company picture book series, which you should see on the screen here, which introduces children and curious grown-ups, that's the phrase, to the lives and works of famous philosophers. Each volume, quote, features an engaging and often funny story that presents basic tenets of philosophical thought alongside vibrant color illustrations, end quote. And I would make the case here too, that the illustrations are not just accompaniment, they're sort of core to the experience of the text. There are, I think, so far 13 titles, although I didn't check that in the last few days, so it's possible there's more, but there's at least 13, and here are a handful of those. And then this particular series is interesting because it's published in German, French, and English. In any case, faith that children's books can be philosophical with or without attention to the nitty-gritty of philosophical exchange and concepts is pretty widespread. In 2013, this book was published, and again, I know the image is not fantastic, but this book by Matthew Roth and Rohan Daniel Eason is a picture book of 3 retold Franz Kafka stories called My First Kafka. And you can see the subtitle here is Runaways, Rodents, and Giant Bugs. And while funny, and it is funny, My First Kafka is not a joke book for adults like The Child's Guide to Freud was. Rather, it's a book for, quote, children of all ages, end quote, in the tradition of writers like Marie Sendak, Edward Gorey, Daniel Handler, et cetera, et cetera. And in her entertaining review of this book, alongside an edited volume called Philosophy and Kafka, so it's a review of this picture book alongside this academic book, Rebecca Schumann writes that it's unfair to compare these two titles because, quote, these are works in vastly different categories. One is a philosophically original exploration of often underrepresented aspects of Kafka's body of work that may have a lasting impact on the genre, and the other is a book of critical essays, end quote. So, all right, so Theory for Beginners is a short, if overpacked book. It just has 3 chapters. So I'll give you a quick outline of them, and then we can move on to discussion and questions, because I think that will be probably a lot more interesting for all of us. The chapters are Philosophy for Children, Theory for Beginners, and Literature for Minors. And I did want to imply a kind of equivalence on both ends of that. So between philosophy, theory, and literature as sort of analogous projects, at least, and children, beginners, and minors as similarly sort of analogous and at least having a family resemblance. So the first chapter is the one that everyone here knows about, which is Philosophy for Children. And there, you could start with the 18th century, you could start with John Dewey and progressive education. Many of the histories of philosophy for children give excellent accounts of this deeper history. And so I didn't do that. I mentioned the research there, but I did not do that. Instead, I really did try to look at the P4C movement. And I did this from the perspective, again, of a literary studies scholar working in children's literature studies without really a lot of exposure to P4C. I did discover that one of the important practitioners, Gareth Matthews here, gave a conference talk at one of the early meetings of the Children's Literature Association, and I think was in conversation with some other folks in that organization. But I think by and large, it's been maybe not, there hasn't been as much conversation there as there could be. In any case, I look at the P4C movement, and I'm interested in kind of the way it overlaps too with the what I think of as a sort of populist approach to philosophy, which has had a resurgence in the last 20 years, but was, at least in the American tradition, is rooted at least from the 1920s on, with the work of things like Will Durant's The Story of Philosophy and so on. So that's a context as well. And the basic commitment here being shared is that philosophy can begin almost anywhere, most especially in the routines and experiences of everyday life, and that children are both natural and inventive philosophers. For P4C, to think philosophically means both to think critically, so to engage in logic and critique, and to think creatively or imaginatively, or to wonder or to speculate. This vision of philosophy aligns with a similar understanding of theory, and this might be where it's a little more interesting for those of you who are P4C folks but not studying critical theory. That same combination, I think, we see in what's called theory, and that same understanding of theory as sort of both interrogative and generative, rigorous and speculative or fanciful. So I won't say anything more about the P4C chapter, since all of you again here are more likely to be experts. But it was a super interesting part for me to research and write about. I do talk about the different emphases within P4C. What I was interested in is, where does children's literature fit in this picture? What kind of literature is being used or produced? How does that change over time? What does that suggest about the movements and maybe broader attitudes about the purpose and texture of writing for kids? So I was interested in that. And so I do talk a little bit about the transition from Matthew Lipman's work to Gareth Matthews and into contemporary P4C, Karen Morris, and many other people who are continuing that work. And I've really enjoyed learning from that. So there's obviously lots of examples of books with philosophical content, and one I talk about in the book is Shinyuki Yoshitake's whimsical picture book, Can I Build Another Me? This is 2015, translated from Japanese. And in this book, young Kevin, he was actually named Kevin Young in the book, is tiring of chores and decides he needs a clone. So he buys a robot and instructs the robot to become another Kevin by watching and imitating him. The book explores all the big questions of ontology and epistemology and ethics, I think. But most centrally, what, if anything, makes a person, and more particularly, that person? In tutoring the robot, Kevin thinks and talks about his physical self, his likes and dislikes, and his abilities and inabilities. He knows he leaves traces of himself. He says, you can tell where I've been, even when I'm not there. In different places, he becomes different people, he realizes. And he also starts to imagine how others imagine him, his parents, his friends, his doctor, teacher, even a visiting alien. There are lots of versions of me, he tries to explain, but all of them are me. I think all of my younger selves are still inside me, he says earlier. So who am I? The harder I think about it, the more questions I come up with. Good thing that the journey matters the most, right? Thinking about yourself isn't always easy, he says, but it can be fun. Can I Build Another Me is just one of many titles we might look at that checks many of the boxes for both philosophical whimsy, to use the phrase from Gareth Matthews, and just kind of fundamental P4C work. It encourages curiosity about and reflection on the problem of identity. There's nothing quite as coherent as this when it comes to theory for beginners. The second chapter, which is about theory for beginners, first looks at the tendency of certain strains of critical theory to present or self-present for beginners and even for children. And then it turns to graphic or image text guides to theory, introductions to theory. What I'm calling theory for beginners is a set of practices, speculations, relations, as much as a set of ideas. It's always performative and sometimes deliberately playful. Theory is concerned with the beginner in part because theory needs beginners. Theory can't reproduce otherwise. theory addresses the adult beginner and folds her into the project. In other words, as with children's literature, the education of beginners becomes part of the apparatus. So theory for beginners doesn't just address beginners, it sort of assumes beginning as a kind of conditional for the enterprise, if that makes sense. A governing principle is that theory, however demanding and whatever provenance, it breaks with tradition and recalls us to the play of ideas. Theory involves critique, but it's not reducible to critique. It has additional functions, including that of enchantment. And I take as my main subject a literature of beginners guides that are sort of aimed at the academic but still more popular reading market. They're described by one scholar as documentary comic books. There are two main series: the beginning series, and which is the one for here, X for Beginners, and there's also the introducing series that look very similar. And hundreds and hundreds of titles are in print. Thousands of copies of those titles are in print. And they have a connection to the even more sort of general reader books like what are they called? The Complete Idiot, the books for complete idiots, or the books for dummies, which have some illustrations, but these are kind of a little more academically situated or inflected. So that's kind of my sort of main topic in this Theory for Beginners chapter. And they have a lot of influences and origins, including a sort of Mittelbau tradition in America of sort of autodidacticism and sort of uplift by kind of popular reading material. But they also emerged in part from the anti-colonial and Marxist labor of Mexican activist and author illustrator Eduardo del Rio, aka Rios. And this is Cuba for Beginners, which was the first of these titles. It was published in 1970. It was very well received, and it led to a series of other books that were translated into English and published in the States and in the UK, other places, that kind of kicked off the whole series, which kind of emphasized both self-teaching and critical awareness of the world. The genre kind of eventually went mainstream, and it lost a little bit, I think, of its leftist political flavor, and became a little bit more kind of not generic, but a little more sort of middle-class intellectual self-help, academic self-help. Not a bad thing, by the way. I'm in favor of academic self-help. But you can see what some of the book, a little bit what the book looks like. There's some references to Alice in Wonderland in this in these illustrations. There's a lot going on here. And in any case, I think that, Theory for Beginners does still sort of hope, like P4C, to sort of reach people outside the academy. I think the image textbooks specifically participate in what one person has called literacy sponsorship. The graphic guides don't just illustrate, in other words, they kind of embody and carry forth visually, they carry forth the visual and material aspects of theory. The guides picture theory, and they also help us do that. So the chapter in the book talks about a number of these. Here's one example, Foucault for Beginners, which offers a very useful introduction to Foucault, but is also a kind of metafictional and feminist correction of Foucault. And I also, in this chapter, consider the place of kind of image text as theory itself, not just as illustration of theory. And so this is one example of that. And this is from the index to a theoretical work by Lauren Ballant and Kathleen Stewart. And it's illustrated throughout, and the illustrations are actually references to concepts in the text and kind of have their own sort of valence. And it's just another indication, I think, of the way that we theorize through images as much as through words. All right, so and the main thing with that chapter too, I was really interested in who uses these books and why and how. These books are often meant for general readers with interest in these topics, but they also get used a lot in the academy. People that want to suddenly get up to speed on Julia Kristeva or anthropology or the history of film and media studies. And so I actually do a lot of interviews with graduate students and faculty and other people around the edges of those groups to sort of get a read on sort of what they think about these materials, how they use them, and then sort of what relation we have to those materials. So I promise I'm almost finished with this talk. I know it's a lot of talking at you. The third chapter, literature for minors, sort of entertains the idea that children's literature, sort of even more typically understood, can be seen as a literature for minors, and even as a minor literature, as conceptualized by Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari in their book on Kafka. Children, of course, are legally minors, but adults can be legal minors too. And this is, I think, where the term minor pushes back in the adult direction in ways that are interesting and maybe a little complicated. Such an understanding of sort of children's literature and maybe literature for adult learners or adult beginners might broaden, I think, our sense of its commitment or purpose. I think about the ways that children's books right now are used with adult learners of, say, a second or third or fourth language, right? People are multilingual, sometimes use children's books to practice their reading, but then also it might be about basic literacy as well as critical and cultural literacy access. In any case, in the case of children's literature, you could sort of play with the idea of minor literature, thinking about what's a dominant discourse, what's inside the dominant discourse. And so I'll talk a little bit about that in the chapter. May or may not be that interesting. But the chapter, in any case, looks at the belief and also affirms the belief that children's literature tends both toward theory and something like a critique of the normal. And so I'm interested in the way that the minor concept migrates a little bit to, is kind of has the seeds of an oppositionality to it as well, even if it also means oppression, right? So the chapter starts with a section on the cultural theorist Walter Benjamin. Then there's a section on the way that Alice in Wonderland has been used in both children's literature and theory, and functions as a kind of one of Alice's circulations is theory, actually. And then the final section, which is the section I had the most fun with, is children's literature as a form of queer theory specifically. And queer theory has a particular history in the academy. It's fairly contemporary, early 90s forward, roughly, depending on how you think about it. But with its kind of, I make the case that children's literature functions not only sometimes as queer literature, but as even a queer theory, in the sense that it encourages sort of theorizing and reflecting on heteronormativity, gender roles, and just basic assumptions about what it means to be a person. So with its singular characters, odd kinships, eccentric plots, fantastical settings, and funky temporalities, children's literature isn't just fabulous material to analyze. I make the case that it also performs for young readers some of the same conceptual and analytical tasks that queer theory does for adults. And this is just a super quick and simplistic sketch of some of the differences between sort of queer theory for adults as a kind of academic genre and maybe queer theory for kids in the form of children's literature. And just to give you some quick examples of some of the titles I talk about, there's Lewis the Fish, in which the main character wants to be a salmon and gets to be a salmon. And there's just no questioning about this. Another book, also an earlier picture book, Imogene's Antlers, about a girl who finds herself, with a head full of antlers, and all of the adults are freaking out about this. But she's very proud of her antlers, thank you very much. And later, at the end of the book, her peacock feathers. So there are many other fun books that you can talk about. I talked about I Want to Paint My Bedroom Blue, which is from is a Ruth Krauss picture book illustrated by Sendak. Ruth Krauss wrote a series of super interesting, I think, philosophical picture books. A Hole is to Dig is another one from the 50s. This is just a gorgeous book that kind of imagines a queer child, pictures a queer child, or a child being queer in multiple ways. And this is one title I talk a little bit about. And then the chapter finally winds down with a discussion of books that are sort of in between academic and self-help, and that are sort of between children's books and books about childhood, including the lesbian cartoonist Alison Bechtel's book, Are You My Mother?, which actually is a memoir, but also echoes the title of a pretty famous picture book with the same name, Are You My Mother, which is, for adults, but preoccupied, I think, with childhood. So that's kind of the book in a nutshell. That's a big theory for beginners. I think. Oh, and I talk about Lemony Snicket. That's a whole other conversation. But I think Lemony Snicket of the series of unfortunate events is another queer theorist of sorts. Yeah, that's been very popular, this series with kids, and uh, and I think that might actually be the end of the slideshow. So I'm going to stop the sharing there and hope that we're back and hope that I haven't gone way over time, which it looks like I have. So
We are back. No, that's wonderful. Thanks, Kenneth. I really enjoyed that. And I just want to tell people, as Kenneth said, he came to study philosophy for children from someone from outside the movement. But I was so impressed with how he got it right. Like his chapter on philosophy for children really gets the movement right. I was very impressed. I really enjoyed it. And then, of course, situating that chapter with the other chapters on literature for minors and theory for beginners brings new meaning to what we're doing in philosophy for children. So I really appreciate that.
oh, thank you. That's
So
high, that's high praise, because I certainly the researching and learning about P4C was, I loved every bit of that, and I know that I don't, I mean, I know I may do some of it justice, but I know that it's a giant enterprise, really diverse and international, and with very different sort of histories in different places, and I respect all of that too. So yeah.
well, yeah, and you point those out in the chapter. You point out some of the tensions and the different points of view and the different ways that people are coming at it. So that was very rich.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask one thing about that very thing. In fact, you
Yeah.
make the observation in the book that a lot of philosophy for children is preoccupied with what you call the rationalist idea of the philosophical child. The P4C wants children to be little philosophers, and there's an adult rationalistic model for that. But you also point out, as you mentioned just a few minutes ago, that in P4C, to think philosophically means to think both critically, logically, and also creatively, to wonder and to speculate.
Yeah.
So my question is, what do you think is at stake for children, and in how philosophy of children and some children's literature presents these different ideals of childhood, of the child, the thinking child or the wondering child?
Yeah, thank you. That's a super interesting question. And I think this is where people with better knowledge than I have of sort of child development and psychology and education, to be honest, probably have a lot more knowledge. I mean, my just hot take on it would be that, it seems to me that they are both absolutely important, and that some kind of balance or dialectic is really critical. And I think you do see that if you're looking at the children's literature record, you do see that dual emphasis almost from the beginning. There was a kind of language, I think it was one of the early Newbery books about, instruction with delight. And that kind of dual sort of emphasis has been, almost really a truism in children's literature, sort of like, you have a responsibility to encourage sort of curiosity, wonder, speculation, but also to teach, to instruct, and also to encourage the rational, the critical sort of interrogation of things, as well as the dreamy sort of orientation. So, and my guess is that most kid readers would be pretty impatient with kid characters who lean too dramatically in one direction or another. I mean, there are probably examples of both, and not to keep coming back to Alice and Alice in Wonderland, but even Alice is trying, so hard to puzzle things out, and her knowledge is incomplete. She's not particularly, she's not, doesn't remember all of her lessons quite, and that's of course the humor of it. And it's not really, I don't think, supposed to be a realistic picture of a child in learning, but I think there is some truth to the fact that she's got both of the, she also has a real high tolerance for pretty improbable things, and enters into the spirit of the space that she's in. And I think you see a balance there. So, I mean, I know that's a kind of maybe too classic example, but but yeah. So I think it is really. I think you do see in children's literature both of those emphases. It's interesting because I was just thinking, some of the child characters who are portrayed as overly inquisitive or critical get a little bit of a bad rap. I'm thinking of like Harriet the Spy, who's so curious, but it's also that she's her, her affect is she's not too interested in the niceties of social exchange, and so she gets pained a little bit for that. But at the same time, she's been a character that a lot of readers have identified with because she's not just curious but obsessive and maybe a little singular and a little sort of proudly eccentric. So that would be those are some of the things that come to mind with that question. Yeah.
Thanks. And I think some of what you just said is relevant too. We have a question from Christopher Parker,
Oh.
who is asking, did you find a methodology or even a formula that the children's writers you studied may have used to evoke philosophical thinking in their work?
So that's super interesting. I don't know if I did find a methodology exactly. I think there are probably patterns, and I think some of them may be keyed to genres. You may see certain kinds of scenarios or possibilities, in picture books that'd be very different from maybe the kinds of things you might see in a middle grade or a YA novel. I mean, I wouldn't want to make too hard and fast distinctions among those genres or the possibilities or the affordances that they have. I do think one common thread, which I think is interesting, has been that most of the people that see books that are successful philosophically or that engage child readers, they tend to emphasize books that do that implicitly rather than explicitly, right? That don't sort of foreground too much the kind of philosophical or critical project. And so I think this goes back to, anxieties about didacticism, right? That dirty word didacticism, how dare you show your educational drive here? And I know that was some of the criticism of Lippmann's, dialogue sort of novels, was they were too nakedly sort of, open about the pedagogical sort of scene, and that there wasn't enough of a plot, or it wasn't incorporated enough into a kind of imaginative story, like maybe world building that you might see that would bring people into a different situation. I think maybe that might be one mechanism that writers may use, whether it's a complex world building sort of situation of, say, speculative fiction, or something just more simple, where you really just have a character in a different setting and kind of confronted with a different experience. So, but I do think there's a preference, and I don't know that, I don't know we have to accept it, but I think there's a preference for implicit rather than explicit kinds of scenarios of thinking and wondering is my read. I don't know what you think. I'd be curious if you think that's
Well,
true.
I think what you're saying is part of the reason that Gareth Matthews, whom you mentioned, would take children's books into his university philosophy classes.
Yes.
And he said, like, one of the reasons was that because some of the books were just directly dealing with issues that he was about to teach.
Yes, I think that's right. And then from what I learned from all of you about this, I think that that phrase he uses, philosophical whimsy, he sees that tendency in some children's books, and he's sort of looking for that. I don't know if that's a formula exactly to speak to the question, but I think it is definitely maybe a little bit of a tendency in the literature, is that the material that sort of tends to have a playful attitude, not just a wondering, deep attitude, but a kind of playful attitude. And maybe some of that is tone. It's interesting. I think that the Winnie the Pooh story is maybe the most iconic in terms of, in terms of recognition, because they're so aphoristic in some ways, right? And that's, I think, why they lend themselves to so much reproduction in popular culture, because all you have to do is twist the context a little bit or tinker a little bit with the language, and they're hilarious and they seem very adult. But there is something about the compression of form there too, and maybe about the tone. There's very little explicit, sort of moralizing. On the other end of the spectrum, maybe is the Lemony Snicket, the series of unfortunate events books, where you have, a narrator that's almost out of the 19th century, like sort of very, very calls attention to himself constantly, like you can't escape the narrator. It's like this voiceover, and it's just, and who really dwells on these awful things that happen to the Baudelaire children. But then there's all these editorial asides. I don't even call them asides. It's kind of a constant, right?
Right.
It's more,
Right.
it's yeah, and there's just constant reflections about basically about survival and what it
Mm-hmm.
takes to survive. And there's all these like life lessons in those books about interiority, for example. Like if you can't escape your, your awful situation, well, you can read and you can escape inside. There's just one of many such lessons. That's why I had that slide I didn't explain. There was a quote from him. So I think there is, but I think there it's so over the top and campy and
Mm-hmm.
sort of
Like,
theatrical that
yeah.
it actually kind of works.
Mhm.
But I know that some of the literary criticism on this question about not just philosophical engagement but ethics in children's literature has made the point that as we got into the 20th century, the author recedes as a kind of narrator, that you don't have a narrator guiding us, that you have more like, here's a scenario, what will
Mm.
the characters do? And don't reflect on that too explicitly. You may still guide them through the shape of your plot and through cues about character behavior, things like that. Yeah.
Mhm. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I wonder if that's also part of what you talked about earlier about uh, the academy sort of seeing itself needing to not only bring in new people into the academy, but also uh, demonstrating to everybody that, like, just philosophy, for example, is part of
Yeah.
everyday life. It's part of the meaning of everyday life for
Yeah.
most people. And like,
Yeah, I think there's some ambivalence around that on the part of academia, and I do think some of the focus on the beginner and maybe even on the child is, I think, a response to maybe the overly baroque a kind of academic tendency in intellectual writing, thinking about just I wouldn't describe it as anti-intellectual, but I think it's anti-institutional. I think especially in philosophy, a lot of philosophy is analytic philosophy. It's so precise. It's so about language use, and it's not something that people participate in, that they're invited to participate in too much. And I think that's why you see people so interested in everyday philosophy, and there's been this like surge of books about that. The philosophy of bumper stickers and all of these books that were published after the early 2000s that kind of introduce again general readers to philosophy through media franchises, through books like Harry Potter and philosophy, Hogwarts and Hogwarts and ethics, and so on. But there's so many, and many of them do use children's and
Mhm.
young adult media or storytelling as a kind of, and I think some of that is really kind of populist in good ways. It's sort of like, yeah, this is an enterprise that everyone can and should be involved with, even if you're not going to spend your time on very, very esoteric kinds of things. And
Right.
I don't mean for that to sound anti-intellectual. I believe in esoteric things. I wouldn't be an academic if I wasn't. But I think that's part of it as well, is that kind of concern about the enterprise maybe becoming a little too rarefied. And I think that's even for theory. Like theory has that investment in complexity, difficulty,
Right.
mastery. There's no question, and that's
Right.
there. At the same time, I think there is a sense that you've got to keep it fresh, and you can't stay too settled in what you know and what you think you know. And I think again that might pick up a little bit on this American tradition of the autodidact and of the self-made person intellectually. Like
Yeah.
we can teach ourselves about these things. I think that's what the popularity of those
Mm.
beginners books is all about, and I see
Mm.
that as a very positive thing.
Mm.
Well, yeah,
I'm interested that I'm interested in, like, part of seeing philosophy and theory as like dimensions of our everyday experience is the effect it might have on how we live. So for Lippmann and Sharp, of course, they were very explicit about, they thought that children practicing philosophy would enable them to see things differently and make better decisions, and
yeah,
as you said in the book, like, be more reasonable, whatever that might mean. I'm linking that in my mind to the way you talk about queer theory for kids and how it might nudge kids to sort of like see the way that heteronormativity is constructed is like reinforced everywhere they look, and start to question that and think about that. But part of that, so part of how children being exposed to this and thinking about it changes their thinking maybe is moving into action. And I'm wondering about what you think about like children's activism, because you make this observation in the book that feminist and Marxist theory, they've contributed to children's advocacy, but they've not actually seen the child as an activist or sort of use the child. And you say it's maybe because they don't want to appropriate children into adult campaigns. And you have this line that in the Lippmann novels, the kids don't take to the streets. But
Well,
on the other hand, you talk about children, adults learning from children, and both Matthews and Ann Sharp in different places wrote about the children should be positioned as a social critic. And of course, today there's lots of children's books that are drawing children into actual activism, political activism. So I'm wondering what you think about that. What's the potential for children's media and P4C to be sort of political activism for young beginners?
Yeah, no, well, I think one of the things, thank you for that question too. I think one of the things that I really admire about P4C is that commitment to, critical thinking and global citizenship. I mean, kind of participation in the democratic public sphere and faith in that. I mean, I think that's something that is so important. And, maybe I overstate the concern of some leftist theory. I do think there is anxiety that any talk about the child somehow is manipulation and is occupying the space of childhood for ideological ends. And I appreciate the critique that we have of that from different quarters. I do think a lot is announced in the name of the child, right? And then coming to you from Florida, where we have very, particular examples of the mobilization of childhood and especially innocent childhood as cover for, what I think of as fairly right-wing kinds of initiatives. But so I do see that spirit in P4C, and maybe the thing about taking to the streets isn't really fair. I think, and I think, frankly, I was at the time thinking more about the early phase of it, where there was sort of the modeling of kind of communities of inquiry in these dialogues, not so much then just the opening up of materials that you see now with people, really using the literature that's out there that does a lot of things. So maybe I'd retract a little bit that, but I do think there is real possibility there. I don't know, that question about the relationship of literature to life and to activism is a hard one, right? Because, on the one hand, we should never mistake improvements to our syllabus as like improvements to the social sphere. It may or may not be that, right? I mean, but I think it can help translate there. I know that, in children's literature, there is a real rich tradition of sort of activist, socialist, leftist, pro-labor, pro-feminist material out there that's been published. And some of it kind of flew under the radar of censors, even during the McCarthy period, because it was children's literature. So who cares, right? And actually, it did pretty important work. I think you can, children's literature has conservative tendencies, it has progressive tendencies, it's a big baggy monster. You see all of those things there. But I do think there's a real rich tradition of that. There's quite a bit of sort of leftist writing in the 20s and 30s. And a couple of scholars have written about this, super interesting. Julia Mickenberg has a book called Learning from the Left, which tracks this. And she and Phil Nell actually put together a kind of coffee table book that reprints some of those stories or excerpts them, called Tales for Little Rebels. And it's sort of, and a lot of the writers of those stories were themselves activists. So that's another way to think about it, right? It's not just the impact it might have on readers, but also just the role of authors in kind of shaping the public discourse and kind of contributing to the cause of democracy. So I think, and a lot of contemporary children's and young adult literature really gets at a wide range of problems and challenges, from class privilege to racial privilege and institutional racism. A lot of interesting work on anti-immigration rhetoric, right? And some of it actually taking the form of graphic novels. So, which I think is super interesting, that's a format that's been really useful for doing that kind of work. So yeah, so I feel pretty optimistic, I guess, about both P4C and children's literature's possibilities there. And I think definitely there's a fundamental commitment to helping encourage independent thinking. I have a colleague who works on nonfiction, Joe Sanders, and he wrote a book about nonfiction. And he says in that book that the best nonfiction is a literature of questions,
Hmm.
not answers. And I thought that was a really useful way for thinking in
Yeah.
some ways about the broader field. So
Yeah, I really like that. Thanks.
yeah, yeah,
We have another question from
yeah.
one of our audience, Manuela Gomez, who comes to us from Spain.
Mm.
She's asking, you said children and quotidianity, quote, did I say that right? Quotidianity makes, makes almost all children's books susceptible of being worked philosophically. If so, could you develop this idea a bit more? Children are natural philosophers. They are newcomers in this world, full of questions and eager to understand the meaning of the world in which they've arrived.
Let's see. I was just looking at the question too. Sorry, I didn't have the
All right.
question chat open. Yeah, I think that so I don't know. I do believe the second part for sure that I'm a convert to the faith that children are philosophers, and I think it's been interesting that that conversation has taken the age back and back, so that now we have with Alison Gopnik
Right.
emphasis on babies as
Maybe.
philosophers and as counterfactual thinkers. I think that
Mm.
emphasis on counterfactuality is probably a really useful one for thinking about how we all fundamentally are always entertaining scenarios besides the one which we're allegedly occupying at that moment. And it's constantly a sort of, maybe a little chaotic sometimes. So I do believe that. And I do think that, I do think that a lot of children's books are motivated, right, by these basic sort of desires and questions, and that therefore have a proto philosophical, if not a philosophical texture. I mean, I think that might be the conversation is how explicit does that need to be? And as I said, I think there's a little bit of a bias against being too explicit, but we have so many books that ask young readers to imagine things that are, what does it mean to live forever, for
Mm.
example, in Tuck Everlasting, or what
Right.
is it like to be a stone? I mean, that's a question I don't know if I can ever answer, but it definitely has stayed with me over the years. I remember coming across Sylvester and the Magic Pebble when I was a kid, and just thinking, what a stone? Okay, um, so I think the staying power of some of those things.
Mm.
So I think that's why I think, and it doesn't mean every children's book does this, right? And I think, and I don't think they should necessarily. Maybe that's a way to respond to
Mm.
Manuela's question too,
Mm.
is that, I think children's books can have a lot of value and a lot of purpose. And there are arguments that children's books, may have informational purpose. Primarily, they may have a kind of therapeutic purpose that's not necessarily about sort of existential questions or about more difficult questions rather. So there may be, and I think that's okay too, right? And maybe it's not fair to expect every book to be philosophical or proto-philosophical, or
Yeah.
to figure out where that line might be.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
That
I don't know
makes
if
sense.
that's a reasonable response but thank you for your question.
I wanted to ask you about something you wrote. You said that philosophy for children tends to downplay the more uncomfortable dimensions of wonder.
Mm,
That the child of P4C is rarely anxious and uncomfortable. And this is something that others have written about, David Backhurst in particular and Peter Shea. The
okay.
philosophy for children tends to ignore the darker side, both of childhood and of philosophy. But as your book points out, children's literature does not ignore those darker sides. And I just want to point out, for instance, our institute, we published a series of reviews of children's books dealing with children in situations of war
Yeah.
and displacement a couple of years ago for use with Ukrainian children. And then I found a YouTube of you speaking at a panel on MIT on
Oh,
that,
yeah.
in part
Yes.
the popularity of apocalyptic and dystopian and traumatic storylines in young adult literature. So I'm wondering, what do you think philosophy for children can learn from children's literature, particularly about the uses that theory, and the way that theory has used children's literature, about children's capacity and their need to be
Yeah.
confronted about these issues?
Yeah, I should say I'm again operating out of ignorance of the many sort of traditions and tributaries of philosophy for children. So I'll have to investigate the work of, did you say it was David
Oh,
Back?
Backhurst, yeah.
Okay, and Peter Shea. Okay, so yeah, I will check that out. I think I mean I think there's definitely a kind of capacity there, and certainly it's there in children's literature. That's the tradition I know a little better. I think there's been a sea change really in kind of the understanding about the possibilities and maybe even the responsibilities of children's literature for dealing with difficult subjects. I think that some of that came, I think, from the gradual sort of acceptance of the idea, or the gradual um, faith in the idea that fairy tales and sort of like myths kind of do psychological, maybe unconscious work. So some of that is the effect of that tradition, and quite a few fairy tales are about conditions of real difficulty, right? And Maria Tatar has written about this, called The Hard Facts of the Brothers Grimm. Bruno Bettelheim, complicated person, problematic figure, but published a book called The Uses of Enchantment, which was probably mostly plagiarized, but kind of popularized that idea as well, that fairy tales are essentially, doing the hard work of kind of psychological, character building. And so I think there's that kind of shifted the conversation a little bit. But I think the first real wave of this, as far as I can tell, in the Anglophone tradition at least, is books about the Holocaust. And it took forever for them to materialize. There was such anxiety about that, and especially picture books. But I think the anxiety all along is, when you expose young readers to difficult topics, are you traumatizing them if you're telling them about trauma? And that's just not an easy question to answer. I mean, this is something I thought about in the Freud book, because you do see finally, about 50 years after the fact, you start to see writing about the Holocaust develop. And then I think from there has been more of an acceptance of the place of books for children about war, about trauma, about genocide, about even now climate change. Starting to see that it's more YA, but there are some picture book titles too. I have a friend
As you mentioned before, racism and
yeah, exactly. So yeah, just exactly. Well, something like the YA novel "The Hate You Give," which is basically
right.
a Black Lives Matter novel. It starts off with the murder of a Black teenager who's unarmed, and that's at the upper end of the spectrum in terms of readership, but very much there. Yeah, and then I have a friend, Jane Gangy, who wrote a fantastic book about genocide in children's literature. And I know that sounds maybe bad to say a fantastic book, but it is. It's a really important book about children's books from around the world dealing with genocides from the 70s forward. So Cambodia, Darfur, Rwanda. And it's also a book about resilience and survival. And yes, it's very much a book about how these novels, and these picture books mostly, register this. There's been, material on terrorism from various perspectives. And so obviously with the massive displacements of people that we're experiencing right now in the lives of children globally, this is something we struggle with on a regular basis, right? But I do think that the literature is there. I mean, and there are always constraints. Publishers do worry about, how far is too far, how much is too much. And there's realities there that you have to deal with. But there's really good work on HIV/AIDS. And one of the scholars working on that, Gabriel Duckles, just finished his PhD at Cambridge, also wrote a chapter for our Kid Lit book about what he's calling emergency children's literature. And it's kind of about HIV/AIDS, but also about literature that emerged around COVID-19, right? Where the priority was get stuff to kids as quickly as possible, get it to them at home. So a lot of books that were, downloadable PDFs, and that were maybe not kind of more conventionally fancifully illustrated and so on. But it's like, okay, this is a global emergency. We need materials explaining why grandma is isolated and dying, and we need to have things that are available now. And there's other examples of that, of course. But
and I think something you said earlier is really helpful too, that philosophizing is one way that kids can deal with things like this, with meaningful events, including traumatic events and traumatic news stories. It's not the only way, of course.
Yeah.
Like some of these books would be suitable to invite kids to philosophize about these kinds of events
Yes.
in their lives and outside. But there's other, as you said, there's other books that are just therapeutic, which is maybe what's needed.
Yeah.
Rather than
You may not
philosophizing.
know in advance how people, because I think there are some usefulnesses to abstraction, right? And to kind of being able to sort of intellectualize difficult things. And so there may be some of that happening. Sometimes it's about reader identification. Sometimes it's about maybe having some remove even as you're encountering this topic.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Well, I'll ask one more question. I'm really interested. You wrote about you call it the conceit of the wonder child. That's through philosophy for children, and I really think you helpfully distinguished what that meant for Matthew Lipman, who envisioned like the reasonable child, whereas for Gareth Matthews, it was more the whimsical, playful thinker of the child. But you're right that P4C rarely embraces or exploits the radical potential of the wonder child, unlike post-structuralist and post-humanist thinkers. So I would love for you to just talk for a little bit about how do you describe that radical potential of the wonder child that we might be missing?
So that's also a good question, and maybe something where I've also not been entirely fair, because I think you do see especially in more contemporary P4C, a kind of a less conventionally humanist understanding of the child, if that makes sense. One that really understands the child as as a kind of nodal point for a lot of different pressures and a lot of different, not just cultural influences, but expectations, anxieties, all those things. I think what I had in mind there was I was thinking a little bit more, maybe a little more narrowly in post-humanist and post-structuralist theory about just the emphasis on the child as almost a chaos agent, or sort of a kind of like a destructive force on those. I think Avital Ronell has an essay about the unrelenting creepiness of childhood. And it's very deliberately polemical and overstated, but she calls the child a security risk for the house of philosophy. And, that is again, clearly an overstatement, but I think there is a sense that, maybe there's a bit too much faith in a kind of conventionally humanist program of development and rational growth and going from one stage to the other. I mean, I think you see this in a lot of, first or second wave developmental psychology as much as anything else. It doesn't really have much place, say, for the unconscious or for regression or for static. And I think you also and I'm also kind of coming at this a little bit from queer theory's interest in the child, kind of along those same lines. Like Catherine Stockton has a book called The Queer Child, where she talks about growing sideways. So rather than growing up, we might grow sideways. Children sometimes grow sideways, and that's okay. And that seems like that's pretty interesting. And then Jack Halberstam talks about wildness as a kind of existential state that's maybe not oriented that much toward purpose or toward the future or toward anything, and maybe wonder could kind of function along those lines a little bit too. Like, wonder is a space, and a state where one can just exist, right, and not necessarily have an instrumentalist kind of goal or expectation there. It might just be a state of receptivity, and you see that in a lot of the classical, descriptions of wonder, including a lot of the ones that circulate in P4C, that this is about being open and to experience and not having maybe particular expectations. So it may not entirely be a fair criticism. It sounds like, P4C probably really ranges in its kind of constructions of the wonder / child. I was initially skeptical of the term wonder because it seemed very fuzzy and sort of like, what is this? This seems like this is kind of retrograde because it allows you to just sort of, but I think the fuzziness is the point, right? I'm kind of now understanding a little bit more that this is a term that's been really useful for people. And I know that like in the 70s, there are a group of scientists who talked about the cultivation of affective wonder, right? Something kind of Carl Sagan and E.O. Wilson, people who are like,
that's right.
This is a strategy for discovery. Like this is actually, and they were thinking about it as a kind of useful thing. Anyway, I don't know if that I think that talks around your question more than response.
I think that's good. No, I think that's really good. Well, I think we're about out of time.
Okay, great.
So let me take this opportunity to refer people to our the IAPC weblog, Thinking in Stories, Reviewing Philosophy in Children's Literature, which has reviews of children's and young adults' books, including some of the ones we've been talking about today. And this was begun in 1979 by Gareth Matthews, who we've also talked about today. It was a column in our journal Thinking, and now it's an active weblog edited by Peter Shea. You can find that on our website at www.montclair.edu/IAPC. So thanks again, Kenneth. This was so enjoyable.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate your patience with all the things I do not know. I'm, as I said at the upfront, I'm excited to be in conversation with everybody. So thank you for your time and your patience.
It's a great opportunity to learn from each other, and I'm sure we'll keep doing that.
I hope
Thanks.
so.
And thanks to everybody who joined us today. Take care.
Have a good season, everybody.
All right.